My name is Madeline, and I am 30 years old. Until tonight, I let my family believe I was nothing but a struggling administrative assistant, barely making rent in Chicago. I sat at a sprawling mahogany table inside the Obsidian, which is one of the most exclusive and elitist restaurants in the entire city. I was wearing a simple red dress. My younger sister Isabella sat across from me, dripping in diamonds she bought on credit. This dinner was supposed to be a celebration of her recent engagement to Cameron. Instead, it became a public execution of my quiet dignity. Isabella leaned across the table and sneered at my outfit. She pointed a manicured finger at my plate and instructed me not to eat. She reminded me that I did not contribute a single penny to this party, and therefore I did not belong. I looked at my mother Diana, expecting her to intervene. Instead, she smiled approvingly at Isabella and took a delicate sip of her champagne. She casually mentioned that real family comes first, while looking right through me. She suggested I should just be grateful they allowed me to sit at the table with them here tonight. The table erupted in quiet laughter. My father Thomas chuckled and patted Isabella on the shoulder. Cameron smirked and poured himself another glass of wine. I looked at the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I simply nodded my head. I stood up from my chair and put on my wool coat. I walked out of the private dining room without uttering a single word of protest. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever fought toxic relatives before. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how I handled what came next, because their smug faces were about to drop. Growing up, my role in the family was always clear. I was the scapegoat, and Isabella was the golden child. My parents worshipped the ground she walked on. They paid for her expensive lifestyle and funded her flashy public relations firm. They always insisted I lacked ambition and style. I let them believe it. I rented a cramped studio apartment to use as a decoy whenever they wanted to visit and inspect my humble daily living situation there. I bought cheap clothes from thrift stores to wear to family events. I played the part of the quiet disappointment perfectly. But reality was entirely different. I was not a low-level clerk. I was the vice president of acquisitions at Apex Holdings. My daily life consisted of hostile takeovers and ruthless corporate liquidations. I dismantled failing companies and rebuilt them for profit. I earned a massive salary and lived in a luxury penthouse that my family knew absolutely nothing about. I kept my wealth hidden because I knew my parents would drain my bank accounts instantly without any hesitation. They would steal my hard-earned money to fund Isabella and her lavish illusions. I wanted to protect my peace, but tonight I had broken my own rule. Earlier this week, my mother called me in a panic. She had tried to book the private room at the Obsidian for Isabella to celebrate her engagement. The restaurant required a massive deposit to secure the space. Diana tried to use her premium credit card, but it was immediately declined. She was terrified of losing face in front of Cameron and his pretentious friends, who expected nothing but absolute perfection every time. She demanded that I call the restaurant and beg them to hold the room, claiming I was merely her assistant. Instead, I did something foolishly generous. I drove to the restaurant myself. I met with the management and quietly put my corporate black card on file to guarantee the reservation. I signed a strict privacy agreement with the hospitality director, ensuring my parents would never know I had bailed them out. I wanted them to have one nice evening. I wanted to show them silent grace. That grace evaporated the moment Isabella declared I did not contribute a single penny. She had no idea that she was only sitting in that velvet chair because my name was on the master ledger. She had no idea my credit limit was the only thing standing between her and utter humiliation. I walked away from the private dining room and made my way down the long, crystal-lit hallway. The air inside the restaurant smelled of expensive perfume and roasted truffles. My heels clicked against the polished marble floor. I approached the front reception desk with absolute purpose. The reservation manager recognized me immediately and stood up straight, offering a warm, genuine smile. He offered a polite evening greeting and inquired if everything was acceptable with my private party. I replied affirmatively while keeping my voice calm and measured. I explained that I needed to make a sudden change to the billing arrangements for the evening. I opened my purse and pulled out my corporate identification and my black card. I placed them firmly on the granite counter under the bright lights. I officially revoked my card as the guarantor for the party in the back room. I instructed him to remove my payment information from their secure system immediately, starting right now. I stated I would pay for the single glass of water I consumed and nothing else. I clarified that the party inside was now fully responsible for the entire final bill. I waited for his confirmation. The manager looked slightly alarmed but maintained his professional composure. He typed rapidly on his computer keyboard. He confirmed my request and assured me that my card had been successfully removed from the file. He noted that the guests inside would be presented with the final check at the end of their meal. I leaned closer to emphasize my strict instructions to him. I ordered him not to offer them any discounts or payment plans. They had requested vintage champagne and imported truffles. I demanded he charge them the full market price for every single item they consumed tonight. If their cards declined, I expected him to follow their standard security protocols for non-payment. He nodded in understanding and promised to handle it according to their strict policy. I thanked him, paid for my water in cash, and walked out the heavy glass doors of the restaurant. The cold Chicago wind hit my face, but I felt incredibly warm inside my chest. For 30 years, I let them hurt me deeply. I had absorbed their insults and swallowed my pride to keep the peace. But peace built on abuse is just a hostage situation. Tonight I was finally breaking out of my cage. I climbed into the back of my waiting town car and told my driver to take me home to my penthouse. I leaned against the plush leather seats and watched the bright city lights blur past the tinted windows. I felt a profound sense of liberation washing over my entire body. I knew exactly what was happening back there. My family was famous for their expensive tastes. Isabella always demanded the absolute best of everything when she believed someone else was paying for it. She would have ordered the most expensive caviar and the rarest cuts of meat. Thomas and Diana would have cheered her on, drinking $1,000 bottles of wine to celebrate their golden child. 15 minutes after I drove away, my cell phone began to light up. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the car. It was a call from my father. I let it ring. Then came a call from my very anxious mother. I let that ring too. Then came a frantic text message from Isabella, followed by an endless stream of furious notifications. The restaurant manager had just walked into their private room and handed Thomas a staggering bill for $42,000. They had tried to hand the manager their credit cards, but every single one of their accounts was returning a declined status. They were completely out of funds, and the restaurant security was refusing to let them leave the premises. My phone vibrated again in my hand. I looked down at the bright screen displaying missed urgent alerts. It was another message from my father demanding that I answer his call immediately. They were trapped inside the restaurant, facing the ultimate public humiliation they had always feared. The facade of their perfect wealthy life was crumbling in front of Chicago elite society. I turned my phone on silent mode and tossed it onto the empty seat beside me. I smiled as the car sped through the night. The trap had finally closed around them, and this was only the beginning of their reckoning. I closed my eyes and let the smooth ride carry me far away from tonight. I instructed the driver to bypass my pristine downtown penthouse and navigate toward the industrial outskirts, dropping me off 3 blocks from my designated decoy apartment. This cramped studio, situated in a dilapidated building, was my ultimate insurance policy against my family's deeply ingrained intrusive nature. Whenever they dropped by unannounced to inspect my supposed poverty or needed to boost their egos by witnessing my fabricated misery, this was the stage where I performed my role as the struggling daughter. I climbed the 3 flights of narrow stairs, allowing the scent of stale hallway carpet and ancient radiator dust to ground me in the reality of my elaborate masquerade. Inside the apartment was a masterful curation of manufactured mediocrity. I had specifically furnished the small space with mismatched thrift store chairs, a sagging mattress placed directly on the floor, and a refrigerator that constantly hummed a jagged tune. I kept fake overdue utility bills stacked neatly on the chipped Formica counter alongside cheap instant coffee. I had chosen to come here tonight, instead of my actual secure home, because I understood their behavioral patterns with absolute certainty. Following their catastrophic humiliation at the restaurant, they would be frantically searching for a physical target for their rage. They would inevitably come banging on this flimsy door, demanding answers, demanding money, and demanding the blood of their favorite scapegoat. I locked the deadbolt, engaged the heavy metal chain, and drew the dusty plastic blinds, feeling an overwhelming wave of safety within these cheap, peeling walls. My personal cell phone began a relentless vibration against the scratched countertop, shaking so hard it nearly rattled off the edge. I stood over the device, watching the cracked screen illuminate the dark kitchen with a rapid, endless succession of toxic notifications. The messages were predictable, reflecting their complete inability to take accountability for their own lavish excess. My mother sent massive paragraphs of vitriol, aggressively blaming me for what she categorized as a catastrophic banking error on my part. She demanded I contact my supposed low-level credit provider, fix the glitch immediately, and return to settle the balance. My father followed up with thinly veiled threats, his texts dripping with his usual authoritarian arrogance. He insisted I owed them a groveling apology for ruining his oldest daughter's pristine engagement celebration and demanded I appear before him by morning. Isabella bombarded me with messages filled with breathtaking entitlement, demanding to know how I dared embarrass her in front of her affluent future husband and his elite circle. She insisted that my financial incompetence was a deliberate, malicious act of jealousy aimed at sabotaging her perfect night. They desperately tried to shift the blame for their financial ruin onto the one person they always treated as a dumping ground for their failures. I felt absolutely no guilt reading their panicked, hateful words. I did not type a single response. I did not attempt to defend myself or explain the harsh reality of their situation. Instead, I calmly navigated to my phone settings and systematically silenced all incoming notifications from their respective numbers. I turned off the screen, plunging the small apartment back into total darkness. I lay down on the uncomfortable mattress, pulled the thin, scratchy blanket over my shoulders, and closed my eyes. For the first time in 30 years, I fell into a deep, uninterrupted, and peaceful sleep, completely detached from their manufactured crisis and entirely unburdened by their impending downfall. Exactly at 6 o'clock the following morning, a different phone broke the absolute silence of the room. It was not my personal device, but a secure encrypted mobile line I kept hidden exclusively for highly sensitive corporate communications. I sat up, brushing the sleep from my eyes, and accepted the incoming transmission. On the other end of the encrypted connection was Kiara, my brilliant 33-year-old sister-in-law. Kiara was an absolute powerhouse, a highly respected African-American corporate defense attorney who had married my older brother Nathan 5 years ago. From the very beginning of her integration into our toxic family dynamic, Kiara had seen right through the superficial glamour and the emotional manipulation my parents constantly employed. Having fought tooth and nail against systemic barriers to reach the top of the corporate legal ladder, she possessed a razor-sharp legal mind and an unparalleled ability to detect deception. Because of her undeniable intelligence and strict discretion, Kiara was the only person in the family who knew the actual truth about my life. She knew all about my executive position at Apex Holdings, my vast corporate resources, my influence in the financial sector, and the sprawling penthouse I truly called home. She became my secret ally, a trusted confidant who shared my disgust for the way Thomas and Diana exploited their children to maintain an elitist facade. I listened intently as Kiara's voice came through the encrypted connection, vibrating with a cold, contained fury that only a seasoned litigator could manage. She quickly and methodically detailed the chaotic aftermath of the restaurant incident. According to her meticulous recounting, My parents had not secured the funds to leave the establishment until the early hours of the morning, facing the utter humiliation of being detained by restaurant security. In utter desperation, Thomas and Diana drove straight to Nathan and Kiara's home at 2 o'clock in the morning. Kiara described how my parents relentlessly banged on their front door, waking them up in a frenzy. They launched into a theatrical display of emotional manipulation, actively weaponizing my brother's deeply ingrained sense of guilt and familial obligation. They fed Nathan a fabricated story about a sudden, devastating financial freeze caused by an identity theft issue, crying and begging him to save them from impending legal charges and public scandal. Kiara explained her anger simmering beneath her professional tone, that Nathan ultimately caved to their relentless psychological pressure. Without consulting her, he accessed their joint emergency savings account, draining the entire balance to bail our parents out of their self-inflicted disaster. Kiara was livid about the betrayal of her marital finances and the blatant disrespect for her boundaries, but she was a tactician above all else. She informed me that she was not wasting her energy screaming at my parents or fighting a futile emotional battle with her heavily manipulated husband. Instead, she had formulated a highly calculated, legally devastating plan to strike back at the very foundation of their arrogance. Kiara explained that her senior position in corporate defense granted her authorized access to intricate, high-level financial tracking networks. She informed me that she was initiating a secure, heavily encrypted file transfer to my device right at that moment. My laptop chimed quietly as a highly classified leaked financial dossier arrived in my secure inbox. I opened the file immediately as Kiara detailed her explosive findings. She explained that draining Nathan's hard-earned savings was only a temporary patch for the massive bill they had racked up at the restaurant. Knowing Nathan would eventually face the reality of his depleted accounts and demand repayment, and desperate to secure a rapid influx of cash to maintain their wealthy illusion for Isabella's upcoming wedding, Thomas and Diana blindly rushed into a new, highly dangerous financial commitment just hours ago. Kiara directed my attention to the second page of the extensive dossier to secure an immediate, high-yield emergency line of credit. My parents had recklessly pledged a major commercial building as collateral to a notorious predatory lending firm known for its ruthless asset seizure tactics. I scanned the legal documentation tracing the columns of numbers, the harsh terms of the predatory loan, and the astronomical interest rates they agreed to in their blind panic. Then my eyes drifted down to the registered name of the lending institution holding this newly minted debt. A slow smirk spread across my face as the pieces of the puzzle slammed perfectly into place. I recognized the lender immediately. It was not just any random predatory bank operating in the shadows of the financial sector. That specific financial institution was a highly vulnerable subsidiary currently undergoing a hostile aggressive acquisition process. And the corporate entity aggressively executing that hostile takeover was none other than my own firm, Apex Holdings. I instructed the driver to navigate toward the financial district. I closed the encrypted dossier and watched the sun bleed through the tinted windows. The irony settled over me. My parents had scrambled in the dead of night to secure a predatory loan to cover their restaurant humiliation and walked straight into the jaws of my corporate machine. I spent the night in my decoy apartment, letting them believe I was in poverty while they terrorized my brother Nathan. I stripped away the cheap sweater and faded jeans I used to play their struggling daughter. I packed them away and left that identity behind. It was time to shed the disguise. The drive took 20 minutes, and I used every second to transition my mindset from the scapegoat into the apex predator I was. The glass and steel monolith of Apex Holdings towered over the Chicago skyline, casting a long shadow over the busy morning streets. I walked through the revolving doors, and the atmosphere shifted from the chaotic city to a realm of absolute control. The air here was sharp and metallic, humming with the quiet intensity of billions of dollars shifting hands. Security guards nodded respectfully as I approached the private executive elevator. I swiped my keycard and rode up to the top floor where walls of floor-to-ceiling glass offered an unobstructed view of the city I helped conquer. I stepped into my corner office and put on my bespoke charcoal suit, buttoning the jacket with precision. I adjusted my cuffs and looked at my reflection. Today was not just another Tuesday. It was the finalization date for a hostile takeover. I walked into the primary boardroom where 24 senior executives, legal analysts, and opposing council members were already seated around a mahogany table. The room fell completely silent the moment I crossed the threshold. I took my seat at the head of the table and opened my portfolio. We were there to sign the final binding documents to swallow a regional predatory lending institution whole. It was the exact same institution my parents had contacted just hours earlier to secure their emergency line of credit. I led the meeting with ruthless efficiency. I dismantled the remaining objections from the opposing counsel one by one, citing regulatory loopholes and aggressive market strategies that left them with no room to negotiate. I forced their compliance on our acquisition terms without raising my voice once. I commanded the room with a cold, steady authority that would have terrified Thomas and Diana if they could see me now. Within 45 minutes, the final signatures were secured. Apex Holdings now officially owned the subsidiary bank, and by extension, we owned every single debt portfolio they held in their entire system. I returned to my corner office and locked the heavy door behind me. I sat down at my desk and accessed the newly integrated banking network on my dual monitors. I bypassed the standard security protocols using my executive clearance and pulled up the fresh loan application submitted by Thomas and Diana under the cover of darkness. I stared at the digital scans of the documents they had desperately signed to secure the cash they needed to pay Nathan back for draining his emergency fund. I scrutinized the asset file they had pledged as collateral to back this dangerous loan. They had put up a prime commercial building located in a highly desirable district of the city. I zoomed in on the property address and a bitter laugh escaped my lips, echoing in the quiet office. The commercial building they had blindly pledged to the bank was the exact same address as the headquarters of Isabella and her supposedly successful public relations firm. For years, Isabella had flaunted that massive office space on her social media, claiming she had purchased it entirely with the massive profits from her booming business empire. She endlessly bragged about her real estate investments at every family gathering, using it as a weapon to belittle my fake administrative job. The truth was glaringly obvious right there on the glowing screen. Isabella did not own a single brick of that building. Thomas and Diana owned it, and they had been letting their golden child use it entirely rent-free to maintain her wealthy illusion. My parents were literally subsidizing her fake success while simultaneously berating me for being a financial failure. They were paying the property taxes, the maintenance fees, and the insurance, while Isabella played the role of a self-made boss. But the deception went much deeper than a free lease and a fake public relations empire. I dug further into the financial history attached to the property, poring over the foundational loan documents from 3 years ago when the building was first purchased. I pulled up the original underwriting files and scrolled down to the guarantor section of the initial mortgage agreement. My breath caught in my throat, and my grip tightened on the edge of my desk. There at the bottom of the scanned page, right beneath the elegant signatures of Thomas and Diana, was a third signature. It was my name. It was my signature. But I had never seen this document in my entire life. I stared at the screen, feeling a terrifying chill radiate through my veins, followed instantly by a wave of white-hot rage. My parents had forged my signature. They had illegally used my identity to list me as a secondary guarantor to secure a better interest rate on a property they bought for Isabella. They had committed felony wire fraud and identity theft against their own daughter, just to ensure their golden child could have a pretty office to take pictures in. They had risked my financial future, my credit score, and my legal standing without a single second of hesitation or remorse. The depth of their depravity was staggering. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked out over the Chicago skyline, letting the reality of their crime wash over me. Any normal person would have immediately picked up the phone and called the federal authorities. Any normal daughter would have marched to the police station, handed over the forged documents, and filed a report for felony forgery, sending her parents straight to jail. But I was not just any daughter, and I was no longer interested in normal, predictable reactions. Calling the police would result in a messy public trial, but it would not give me the absolute control I desired over their fate. I decided to play a much longer and far more devastating corporate game. I picked up my phone and dialed the head of my internal acquisitions team. I used my executive authority to issue a direct and unyielding order. I instructed my team to isolate the entire debt portfolio belonging to Thomas and Diana immediately. I ordered them to legally purchase every outstanding loan credit line and mortgage my parents held, consolidating all of their financial liabilities directly under my personal executive purview at Apex Holdings. I told my team to spare no expense and to execute the transfers through our newly acquired subsidiary network, so my parents would not receive any immediate notification of the change in ownership. I did not just want to expose their crimes to the authorities. I wanted to own them completely. I wanted to hold the invisible strings of their entire fake empire in my hands, so I could dictate exactly when and how their world would collapse. The transfer took less than 20 minutes to initiate. By the time I hung up the phone, Apex Holdings was the sole owner of their financial existence. I was now their ultimate creditor. I was just finalizing the transfer protocols when the secure intercom on my desk buzzed. I pressed the button to connect with the executive receptionist stationed at the front of the floor. Her voice came through the speaker, sounding unusually tense and highly professional. She informed me that there was a significant disturbance currently unfolding down in the main lobby of the building. She stated that 3 individuals identifying themselves as Thomas, Diana, and Isabella were causing a massive scene at the security desk. They had apparently tracked my phone location using a family sharing application I had forgotten to disable on my personal device. They assumed I worked here at Apex Holdings as a low-level cleaner or a basic clerk based on my decoy lifestyle. The receptionist reported that they were screaming at the guards, demanding that I come down to the lobby immediately to fix my mess from the restaurant last night. I smiled a cold, empty smile and told the receptionist to hold them there. I stood up, smoothed my tailored suit jacket, and prepared to descend. I was ready to face them. I walked slowly toward the gleaming glass elevator, anticipating the exact moment their arrogant illusions would completely shatter into pieces. The descent in the glass elevator took exactly 40 seconds. I used that brief window of isolation to completely dismantle my executive persona. I let my shoulders slump forward, erasing the rigid, commanding posture that defined my professional life. I softened my jawline and dropped my gaze, transforming my expression into one of chronic anxiety and submissive hesitation. I was no longer the ruthless corporate liquidator who had just finalized a massive hostile takeover. I became the pathetic, struggling sister my family expected to see. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the expansive ground floor of Apex Holdings. The lobby was a vast, echoing cavern of imported white marble and brushed steel, designed specifically to intimidate anyone who walked through its rotating doors. Sunlight poured through the massive glass facade, illuminating the frantic, chaotic scene unfolding near the main security desk. Thomas, Diana, and Isabella were standing in a tight, aggressive cluster, harassing the lead receptionist. They looked entirely out of place in this hyper-refined environment. Isabella was draped in an obnoxious, oversized designer coat with massive logos plastered across the fabric. She was waving her hands wildly while Diana demanded immediate assistance from the stone-faced staff. Thomas stood with his chest puffed out, attempting to exert authority in a building that could crush his entire net worth before lunch. They had tracked my personal cell phone signal to this exact address. Because they possessed zero capacity to imagine me achieving anything substantial, they automatically assumed I was working here as a low-level janitor or a basic administrative clerk. Isabella spotted me walking slowly across the polished marble floor, her face contorted into an ugly sneer of pure entitlement. She abandoned her argument with the receptionist and marched directly toward me, her high heels clicking loudly, echoing through the quiet lobby. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. She demanded to know how I dared to show my face after the massive catastrophe I caused at the restaurant last night. She loudly declared that I had intentionally sabotaged her beautiful engagement dinner out of pure bitter jealousy. She claimed my supposed banking error was a deliberate attack on her happiness and that Cameron was deeply traumatized by the event. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings, drawing the attention of several passing investment bankers who glanced at the scene with mild amusement. I kept my head bowed and offered a weak, trembling apology, perfectly playing the role of the terrified subordinate. Isabella did not care about my apologies. She demanded immediate financial compensation for her severe emotional distress. She told me to march right back up those stairs and beg my manager for a massive advance on my pathetic paycheck. She stated that I owed her a proper celebration and that I needed to drain whatever meager savings I had left to make things right. Diana stepped forward, nodding in fierce agreement with her golden child. My mother crossed her arms and glared at me, stating that I had disgraced the family name in front of Chicago elite society, and that I needed to take immediate responsibility for my failures. Thomas, aggressive and impatient, pushed past my mother and stepped directly into my personal space. He did not bother with pleasantries or greetings. He shoved a thick, heavy stack of stapled legal papers aggressively into my hands. He ordered me to stop crying and start being useful for once in my life. He claimed the documents were just standard family support forms. He spun a rapid, fabricated story about Isabella needing a minor business loan to expand her highly successful public relations firm. He stated that the bank simply needed a secondary character reference to finalize the approval process and ordered me to sign the back page immediately without asking any stupid questions. I held the stack of papers in my hands, feeling the heavy weight of their deception. I kept my eyes wide and innocent, but my mind immediately shifted into high gear. Years of dissecting complex corporate acquisitions and analyzing predatory lending contracts allowed me to speed read the dense legal jargon with absolute precision. I scanned the first page, bypassing the generic introductory clauses, and zeroed in on the actual meat of the contract. My heart beat steadily with cold, calculated realization. Thomas was lying straight to my face. This was not a character reference or a simple business loan application. It was a formal transfer of liability agreement. Isabella was not expanding her fake public relations empire. She was drowning in severe legal trouble. The documents detailed a massive outstanding federal tax debt attached directly to her business entity. She owed the government exactly $150,000 in unpaid taxes and penalties. The paperwork Thomas was trying to force me to sign was a legally binding assumption of debt. They were actively attempting to shift the entire $150,000 burden directly onto my personal Social Security number. They wanted me to take the fall for her tax evasion so Isabella could walk away completely clean and continue living her lavish, fraudulent lifestyle without the threat of federal prosecution hanging over her head. The sheer audacity of their trap was breathtaking. They had driven to my workplace to verbally abuse me and trick me into financial ruin, all within the same breath. They truly believed I was too stupid and too submissive to read the fine print. As Thomas pulled a silver pen from his jacket pocket and shoved it toward my face, the tension in the lobby reached a boiling point. The raised voices and aggressive body language had finally triggered the Apex Holdings security protocols. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw two heavily built tactical security guards moving swiftly across the marble floor. They were highly trained professionals tasked with removing immediate threats from the executive premises. The guards approached Thomas from behind, their hands resting near their utility belts, ready to physically restrain him and throw my entire family out onto the cold concrete sidewalk. My family remained completely oblivious to the impending physical removal. They were too focused on bullying me into signing my life away. I realized that if the guards intervened, the confrontation would end prematurely. I needed these documents. I needed to secure this physical evidence of their attempted fraud. I looked past my father's shoulder, and locked eyes with the lead security guard. Without changing my terrified facial expression, I slowly raised my right hand. I extended a single index finger in a subtle, sharp motion. It was a silent, executive command. The lead guard immediately recognized the gesture. He stopped dead in his tracks, tapping his partner on the shoulder. Both heavily built men instantly froze, taking 2 synchronized steps backward and folding their hands behind their backs. They stood at attention, fading silently into the background, waiting for my next command. Thomas, Diana, and Isabella completely missed this massive display of absolute corporate power. They had no idea that a single twitch of my finger had just saved them from being violently hurled out the front doors. I returned my focus to the fraudulent documents in my hands. I needed to extract this evidence without raising any suspicion. I allowed my hands to tremble visibly. I took a sharp, shallow breath, feigning a state of overwhelming panic and anxiety. I looked up at Thomas with wide, fearful eyes. I told him that I was too scared to sign anything without reading it first. I stammered, playing the part of the intimidated worker, claiming that I needed to show these papers to my boss to prove why I needed a paycheck advance. I argued that my manager was incredibly strict and would only give me the money if he saw exactly what the funds were being used for. Thomas scowled heavily, clearly frustrated by the delay in his scheme. Isabella rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic groan, complaining about my endless incompetence. Diana stepped in, urging Thomas to let me take the papers upstairs if it meant getting the cash they desperately needed today. She reminded him that they could not afford to wait any longer. Thomas snatched the silver pen back and pointed it at me, issuing a harsh final warning. He ordered me to take the papers to my manager, secure the maximum cash advance possible, and bring both the money and the signed documents back to their house by tonight. I nodded rapidly, folding the damning tax documents with careful precision. I slid the paperwork safely into my leather briefcase, securing the metal clasp. I possessed the physical proof of Isabella attempting to commit federal tax fraud and my parents acting as direct accomplices in the conspiracy. I offered them one final timid apology, shrinking away from their aggressive posture. I turned my back on them and walked slowly toward the glass elevator, keeping my head down until the doors finally slid shut, closing them out of my sight. As the elevator began its rapid ascent back to the executive floor, I stood up straight and rolled my shoulders back. A cold, dark smile spread across my face. I had everything I needed to destroy them. The physical evidence resting inside my leather briefcase was the final nail in their coffin. They thought they were setting a trap for a naive, weak-minded victim. Instead, they had just handed a loaded weapon directly to their executioner. I watched the lobby shrink away below me, ready to initiate the next phase of their absolute ruin. This beautiful stack of papers guaranteed that Isabella would face severe federal consequences for her elaborate financial crimes. My parents had unknowingly provided me with the ultimate leverage to crush their pathetic suburban empire into dust. I felt an exhilarating rush of adrenaline flooding my veins. Their blind, arrogant confidence was their greatest weakness, and I was going to exploit every single blind spot they possessed. I stepped out of the elevator and strode back into my corner office, closing the heavy wooden door behind me. I placed the briefcase on my desk and pulled out the encrypted phone. It was time to call my brilliant sister-in-law. It was time to completely dismantle the golden child. I pressed the designated speed dial button on my encrypted device and waited for the secure connection to route through our private corporate servers. Kiara answered immediately, maintaining her usual crisp, professional tone. I informed her that the lobby ambush had provided us with an unexpected treasure trove of documentary evidence. I requested an urgent off-the-grid meeting away from the prying eyes of our respective corporate environments and far beyond the reach of our incredibly toxic family. Kiara agreed without hesitation, suggesting a discreet location we had utilized for highly sensitive legal discussions in the past. I packed the fraudulent tax documents back into my leather briefcase, locked my corner office, and took the private executive elevator down to the underground parking garage where my dedicated driver was already waiting to transport me into the quiet shadows of the city. The location Kiara selected was an underground upscale jazz lounge hidden beneath a nondescript commercial building in a forgotten district of Chicago. The establishment was deliberately difficult to find, requiring patrons to descend a narrow wrought iron staircase and pass through a heavy, soundproofed mahogany door. Inside, the atmosphere was cloaked in deliberate obscurity. Thick, dark velvet curtains absorbed the ambient noise, and dim amber lighting cast long, obscuring shadows across the intimate leather booths. The air smelled of expensive bourbon and melting candle wax. It was the absolute perfect environment for exchanging highly classified information and dissecting the impending ruin of my arrogant relatives. I navigated through the labyrinth of small, crowded tables and found Kiara seated in a secluded corner booth, furthest from the small stage, where a lone saxophonist played a slow, melancholy tune. I slid into the curved leather seat opposite my sister-in-law, placing my briefcase carefully on the dark wooden table between us. Kiara looked impeccable, wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit that commanded respect and radiated absolute authority. Her dark eyes gleamed with a predatory intelligence as she nodded a silent greeting. I opened the metal clasps of my briefcase and withdrew the folded tax transfer documents Thomas had aggressively tried to force me to sign earlier that afternoon. I slid the paperwork across the polished wood. Kiara picked up the pages, her eyes scanning the dense legal text with terrifying speed and precision. I watched a cold, calculating smile form on her face as she digested the sheer magnitude of the federal crime my family had blindly attempted to commit. She placed the documents down and quietly confirmed my suspicions, noting that the paperwork was a blatant, illegal attempt to shift a massive corporate tax liability onto an unsuspecting third party. Kiara then reached into her own structured designer tote bag and produced a thick, heavy folder covered in thick black redaction marker across the front cover. She placed it squarely in the center of the table, resting her hands firmly on top of it. She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a soft, intense murmur as she began to unpack the devastating results of her deep-dive financial forensic investigation. Over the past 48 hours, Kiara had utilized her extensive corporate defense network to completely unmask the glittering illusion of Isabella and her highly publicized public relations firm. The truth was far more pathetic and significantly more destructive than either of us had initially anticipated. Kiara revealed that Isabella possessed absolutely zero legitimate corporate clients. The entire public relations firm was nothing but an elaborate empty shell company designed exclusively to fund my sister's narcissistic social media addiction. The lavish designer wardrobes, the luxury imported vehicles, the endless expensive lunches, and the constant stream of high-end cosmetic procedures were not the result of a booming business empire. Kiara explained that every single cent funding this spectacular fraudulent lifestyle was being systematically drained directly from the primary retirement accounts of Thomas and Diana. Our parents were willingly bleeding their entire financial future dry simply to maintain the manufactured perception of their golden child achieving elite high society status. I sat back against the velvet cushions, absorbing the staggering weight of their collective delusion. Thomas and Diana were completely oblivious to the impending disaster. They were so deeply blinded by their desperate obsession with Isabella and her perceived elite status that they were eagerly signing away their pensions, their property equity, and their fundamental security just to keep her online feed looking wealthy. They truly believed they were investing in a corporate prodigy, when in reality they were throwing millions of dollars into a bottomless pit of vanity and gross incompetence. They were so busy criticizing my fake administrative job that they completely failed to notice their favorite daughter deliberately bankrupting their entire existence. But Kiara was not finished. She tapped the thick folder with her manicured fingernail, signaling that the most devastating revelation was yet to come. She shifted the topic from my sister to Cameron, the man my family considered the perfect wealthy addition to their elite circle. Kiara had dug into his personal financial footprint and uncovered a betrayal so profound it almost made me pity Isabella. Almost. Cameron was not a successful entrepreneur or a wealthy heir. He was a highly skilled professional parasite, and he had recently realized that the well of my parents' retirement funds was rapidly running completely dry. Kiara meticulously detailed his exit strategy. Facing the grim reality of an empty bank account and the looming threat of massive federal tax audits, Cameron had secretly filed for a secondary burner passport under a slightly altered alias. Over the past 3 weeks, he had been quietly and systematically liquidating the last remaining tangible assets hidden within Isabella's fake business structure. He was siphoning the final drops of cash into untraceable offshore accounts. Kiara revealed that he had already booked one-way first-class flights out of the country, specifically targeting a jurisdiction that held no extradition treaty with the United States. He was not planning to take Isabella with him. The secondary passenger ticket was booked under the name of his long-term hidden mistress. The sheer scale of the impending catastrophe was breathtaking to process. Cameron was preparing to vanish into thin air, leaving Isabella completely abandoned and entirely broke. More importantly, his calculated departure would leave Isabella Thomas and Diana holding the bag for catastrophic amounts of federal tax debt, corporate fraud, and defaulted predatory loans. When the government inevitably came knocking to collect the hundreds of thousands of dollars owed, they would find an empty shell company, a hysterical, abandoned golden child, and two parents whose assets were completely leveraged to the breaking point. The trap they had built for themselves was flawless and inescapable. I looked at Kiara, acknowledging the masterful investigative work she had accomplished. We both understood that we did not need to lift a single finger to destroy them. We simply needed to stand back and watch the natural consequences of their boundless arrogance crush them into dust. We finalized our strategy, agreeing to let the impending foreclosure actions proceed exactly as planned while maintaining absolute silence regarding Cameron and his impending escape. We would let them continue to believe they were untouchable right up until the exact second the floor collapsed beneath their feet. As Kiara gathered her forensic documents and placed them back into her tote bag, my secure mobile device vibrated heavily against the wooden table. A notification illuminated the screen, pulling my attention away from our corporate plotting. It was an electronic invitation forwarded directly to my personal email address. I opened the message and found an incredibly ornate digital flyer for an upcoming elite high society charity gala scheduled for this weekend at a premier downtown hotel. It was exactly the kind of pretentious, hyper-expensive event my parents desperately constantly tried to infiltrate to prove their worth to the Chicago upper class. Accompanying the flashy digital invitation was a harsh, demanding text message from Diana. My mother did not ask if I was available or if I would like to attend as a guest. Instead, she issued a rigid authoritarian command. She ordered me to report to the service entrance of the venue on Saturday night. She stated she had pulled strings with the event coordinator to secure me a temporary shift, working as a catering server for the evening. She aggressively dictated that I was to serve drinks to her wealthy peers, keep my head down, and most importantly, hand over my entire night of minimum wage tips directly to Isabella to help offset the extreme stress I had caused the family. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the unbelievably toxic message twice to fully process the sheer magnitude of her entitlement. She truly believed she possessed the authority to order a corporate executive to serve her appetizers and surrender spare change to a sister currently committing federal tax evasion. The sheer absurdity of her demand was the perfect conclusion to this evening of dramatic revelations. I looked up at Kiara, who was watching my reaction with a knowing expression. I did not express anger or frustration. I simply smiled a cold, sharp smile. I tapped my screen, bringing up the reply keyboard. I typed a single, simple word in response to my mother and her ridiculous catering demands. I typed confirmed and placed the phone back into my pocket, ready for the gala. I pocketed the phone after sending that single word to my mother. Her audacious demand fueled my focus for 48 hours. She expected me to serve appetizers to her peers and hand my tips to my sister. Instead, I prepared for my actual role at the charity gala. I visited a stylist to select a gown commanding absolute authority. The Grand Plaza Hotel ballroom was the pinnacle of Chicago society. It was a place where fortunes were flaunted and corporate empires collided. I was not walking in as a subordinate. I was walking in as a conqueror. Saturday evening arrived quickly. The Grand Plaza Hotel looked spectacular, draped in cascading crystal chandeliers and heavy gold velvet accents. The ballroom transformed into a display of elite wealth. I bypassed the main entrance completely. My private driver pulled up to the secured underground VIP access tunnel. I was escorted up a private glass elevator reserved strictly for platinum-tier corporate sponsors. Apex Holdings had donated a massive sum to secure the paramount viewing balcony overlooking the ballroom floor. From my vantage point, I had an unobstructed view of the glittering crowd below. I stood in shadows, nursing sparkling water, waiting for the perfect moment. Right on schedule, my family made their grand entrance through the main ballroom doors. Thomas and Diana walked ahead of Isabella and Cameron. They were dripping in flashy, oversized jewelry that practically screamed desperation. I knew every single piece of that jewelry was purchased using credit cards teetering on their absolute limits. Isabella wore a heavily sequined gown that looked incredibly expensive but lacked any real sophistication. Cameron trailed behind her wearing a tuxedo that fit too tightly around his shoulders. He looked like a man calculating his escape route. I watched from above as my mother immediately began scanning the perimeter of the room. Diana narrowed her eyes and inspected the catering staff carrying silver trays of champagne. She was hunting for me. Cruel anticipation radiated from her posture. She was desperately looking forward to the power trip of ordering me around in front of the city elite. She wanted to point me out to her friends and humiliate me to elevate her own status. Isabella mirrored her, scanning the serving stations with a vicious smirk, ready to demand a drink. They stopped a passing waiter and aggressively questioned him. I could not hear their words, but the waiter shook his head and hurried away, looking highly annoyed by their abrasive behavior. The evening progressed with excruciating slowness. The wealthy attendees mingled near the stage, clinking their crystal glasses and exchanging hollow pleasantries. My family secured a table near the center of the room, acting as though they belonged among billionaires. Thomas loudly boasted about his real estate portfolio to anyone forced to sit near him. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his entire financial existence currently belonged to me. The charity director took the main stage, tapping the microphone to signal the start of the live auction. The proceeds were meant to support local urban development initiatives. The auctioneer began listing the premium items available for bidding. The first few items were modest packages, including private chef dinners and spa retreats. My family remained quiet during these initial rounds, waiting for a larger prize. Then the auctioneer announced the premier item of the evening. It was a 2-week stay at an exclusive, fully staffed European villa located on the Amalfi Coast, complete with private jet transit. The starting bid was established at $40,000. A ripple of excited murmurs spread across the ballroom floor. Several prominent business owners raised their numbered paddles, driving the price up rapidly in increments of $5,000. The bid reached $55,000. Isabella gripped her paddle tightly. I watched her lean over and whisper frantically to Thomas and Diana. She was desperate to maintain her wealthy facade in front of the city elite. She needed to prove she was just as rich and powerful as the corporate titans sitting in the room. I knew exactly what her internal logic was. She fully intended to win this auction and force my parents to leverage their commercial building again tomorrow morning to cover the massive cost. She did not care about the financial devastation it would cause them. She raised her paddle high into the air. The auctioneer pointed directly at her table. Isabella boldly bid $60,000. The ballroom went completely silent for a brief moment. A bid of that size from a relatively unknown entity drew significant attention. Diana beamed with pride, clapping her hands together in sheer delight. Thomas puffed out his chest, looking incredibly smug, as the surrounding tables murmured in impressed tones. Isabella lifted her chin, basking in the temporary adoration of the Chicago upper class. The auctioneer asked if there were any other takers in the room. He called out the $60,000 bid, twice warning that the exclusive European villa was about to be sold. It was the exact moment I had been waiting for all evening. I stepped out of the shadows of the Platinum Tier VIP balcony and moved directly to the glass railing. I raised my own paddle with slow, deliberate precision. The auctioneer immediately caught the movement from the elevated sponsor section. He pointed his gavel toward the balcony. He loudly announced a counterbid of $65,000 from the VIP tier. The entire ballroom shifted their collective attention upward. The lighting technician, following the auctioneer command, swung a massive, brilliant spotlight directly onto my position. The blinding white light illuminated the balcony for every single person in the room to see clearly. I stood there, radiating absolute power. I was wearing a breathtaking custom emerald green couture gown that flowed perfectly to the floor. My hair was styled in an immaculate sharp cut, and I wore zero jewelry, letting my raw confidence command the space. I was flanked by two of the most powerful and ruthless investment bankers in the city, who nodded respectfully as I placed my bid. The visual contrast was absolutely staggering. I was no longer the frumpy, submissive sister wearing thrift store clothes. I was a corporate titan dominating the highest echelon of the room. A collective gasp echoed from the center table below. Diana dropped her crystal champagne flute. The glass shattered against the ballroom floor, spilling expensive liquid across her shoes. Thomas turned pale, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. He stared at the platinum balcony, unable to process the reality of his oldest daughter standing shoulder to shoulder with billionaires. Cameron looked terrified, shrinking back into his chair as if trying to physically disappear. But Isabella reacted exactly as I knew she would. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She was completely blinded by jealousy and furious that her ultimate moment of triumph had been stolen by the scapegoat. Isabella refused to be outdone. She could not stomach the idea of losing to me in front of hundreds of elite spectators. She aggressively shoved her chair back and stood up, ignoring her father. Panicked attempt to pull her down. She raised her paddle violently into the air. Her voice shrieked across the quiet ballroom, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. She recklessly bid $75,000 to secure the European villa. The crowd murmured in shock at the massive sudden escalation. The auctioneer looked back up to the VIP balcony, waiting for my response. I simply lowered my paddle and offered a polite, deferential nod. I did not place another bid. I had achieved my exact objective. The auctioneer struck his wooden gavel against the podium with a loud, definitive crack. He cheerfully declared Isabella the winner of the premier auction package. A smattering of polite applause rippled through the room, but the tension remained incredibly thick. Diana and Thomas looked physically ill, realizing the astronomical sum their golden child had just committed them to paying. Cameron stared at the exit doors, clearly calculating his immediate escape. Isabella remained standing, breathing heavily, still glaring up at the balcony with a venomous, triumphant smirk, thinking she had just defeated me. The event staff immediately mobilized across the very large room to secure the finalized transaction. Following standard charity gala protocol, a senior coordinator approached Isabella's table carrying a secure mobile credit card terminal to process the massive immediate deposit. Isabella confidently reached deep into her beaded designer clutch to retrieve her premium credit card. Up on the balcony, I maintained completely steady eye contact with my sister. I smoothly retrieved my highly secure encrypted phone from my clutch. I opened the proprietary internal application linked directly to the Apex Holdings financial network. As the event coordinator extended the payment terminal directly toward Isabella I, discreetly tapped a single red button on my screen, authorizing the system to instantly freeze all of my parents' and Isabella's debt-leveraged accounts. The red button on my screen pulsed once, confirming the execution of my command. Down on the expansive ballroom floor, the event coordinator finally reached Isabella's table. She carried a silver payment terminal, presenting it with a courteous smile. Isabella did not even look at the woman. She kept her eyes fixed on the empty space where I had been standing, basking in what she believed was her ultimate triumph. She blindly reached into her designer clutch and pulled out her metal card. She dropped it onto the tray with an arrogant flick of her wrist. The coordinator inserted the chip. The machine processed the transaction for 3 agonizing seconds before emitting a harsh beep. The digital screen flashed a bright red error message. The coordinator maintained her professional composure and politely informed my sister that the card had been officially declined. Isabella snapped her attention back to the table. Her smug expression vanished, replaced by sheer indignation. She loudly accused the coordinator of operating faulty equipment. She snatched the card back and shoved a second one toward the terminal. The machine beeped again, declined. The color began to rapidly drain from Isabella's face. She turned to Cameron, demanding he hand over his card to resolve the glitch. Cameron was already sweating profusely. He fumbled with his leather wallet, his hands trembling violently as he pulled out a dark blue card. The coordinator swiped it through the machine. The same harsh beep echoed above the low hum of the ballroom. Declined. The flashing red screen illuminated Cameron's terrified face. He knew the money was gone. He knew his secret escape plan was unraveling in real time, but he could not say a word without exposing his own criminal betrayal to the entire room. Isabella started breathing heavily, her voice rising in pitch as she demanded they try the transaction one more time. The heavy tension at the center table quickly thickened into a suffocating cloud. Thomas, realizing his golden child was causing a highly visible scene in front of the exact social circle he desperately wanted to impress, decided to take full charge. He puffed out his chest and stood up, attempting to project the aura of a wealthy patriarch who was only minorly inconvenienced by a banking technicality. He pulled his wallet from his tuxedo jacket and produced 3 premium platinum cards. He handed them to the coordinator with a condescending chuckle, apologizing loudly for the supposed fraud alert trigger that often accompanied such large, spontaneous purchases. He instructed her to run his primary account first. The coordinator swiped the first platinum card. The terminal beeped loudly. The error code was entirely different this time. It did not just say declined, it displayed a stark, bold message indicating a frozen account due to severe delinquency. Thomas lost his condescending smile instantly. He urged her to try the second card immediately. Swiped, beep, frozen. He practically shoved the third card into her hand, his face turning dark crimson. The final swipe yielded the exact same devastating result. Every single line of credit, every emergency reserve, every financial safety net my parents possessed had been instantaneously locked down by the Apex Holdings network. They had absolutely zero access to capital. The harsh reality of their situation began to physically manifest. Thomas began to sweat through his expensive tailored suit. Diana clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes darting frantically around the room. The people at the neighboring tables had completely stopped eating. The gentle clinking of crystal glasses and the soft hum of polite conversations slowly died away. The silence spread outward from my family's table like a fast ripple in a pond, until the entire ballroom was collectively holding its breath watching the disaster unfold. The charity director, a formidable woman who had spent decades organizing high-stakes fundraising events for the Chicago elite society, noticed the escalating commotion. She marched across the ballroom floor, her heels striking the polished wood with absolute purpose. She bypassed the coordinator and looked directly at the glowing terminal screen. She then looked at Thomas and Isabella with an expression of pure disgust. She did not bother to lower her voice. She loudly and clearly informed my father that bidding $75,000 without verified accessible funds was not a simple misunderstanding. She stated firmly that executing a fraudulent bid at a registered charity auction constituted felony wire fraud. Her voice carried easily across the exceptionally quiet room. The harsh whispers began immediately. The investment bankers, the real estate tycoons, and the corporate executives, leaned in toward each other, murmuring about the deeply embarrassing spectacle. They recognized a sinking ship when they saw one. Isabella tried to protest, her voice shrill and panicked, claiming that she was a highly successful business owner and that her bank was simply making a catastrophic error. The charity director cut her off completely. She signaled to the hotel security guards stationed near the main exits. She bluntly told Thomas that they had exactly 3 minutes to produce a valid form of payment, or she would be forced to contact local authorities to report the fraudulent activity immediately. The sheer panic in my parents' eyes was intoxicating to witness. Their entire world, built exclusively on fake prestige and massive hidden debt, was imploding under the bright lights of the Grand Plaza Hotel. They had nowhere left to hide, and no one to rescue them from the consequences. I decided it was the perfect time to make my exit. I turned away from the glass railing of the balcony and began my descent down the sweeping illuminated staircase that connected the VIP tier to the main ballroom floor. I moved with slow, deliberate grace. My emerald gown trailed softly behind me, brushing against the marble steps. I certainly did not rush. I wanted them to see me clearly. I wanted them to process the vast impossible gap between where they stood in disgrace and where I was standing in triumph. Diana was frantically searching the crowd for an exit strategy when her panicked eyes locked onto me. She saw the custom gown, the impeccable styling, and the two powerful executives walking respectfully behind me. Her desperate mind short-circuited. Unable to comprehend that I was the actual architect of her destruction, she defaulted to her usual toxic assumptions. She genuinely believed that I had simply managed to secure a wealthy older man to fund my sudden glamorous transformation. Driven by pure, blind desperation, she abandoned her husband and her golden child, breaking away from the center table. She ran clumsily across the ballroom floor, intercepting me right at the base of the grand staircase. She aggressively grabbed my forearm, her perfectly manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. She was hyperventilating, her makeup smudged from the sweat gathering on her face. She pulled me close and hissed frantically into my ear, demanding that I tell my new rich boyfriend to come over and pay the charity director right now. She ordered me to use whatever leverage I had over my supposed wealthy date to clear their massive $75,000 debt to save the family from imminent arrest. I looked down at her trembling hand gripping my arm. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I smoothly and forcefully removed her fingers from my skin, brushing my arm as if brushing away ordinary dirt. The charity director and the hotel security guards had followed Diana to the base of the staircase, standing just a few feet away. The entire ballroom was watching us with bated breath. I took a deep breath and pitched my voice so it carried perfectly across the silent room, ensuring every single wealthy patron heard my next words. I addressed the charity director directly, bypassing my mother entirely. I introduced myself clearly and unapologetically as the Vice President of Acquisitions at Apex Holdings. I watched the recognition wash over the faces of the investment bankers standing nearby, validating my absolute authority. I gestured coldly toward Diana, Thomas, and Isabella, who were now completely surrounded by security personnel. I stated with razor-sharp precision that these specific individuals had absolutely no ties to my corporate accounts, no access to my personal assets, and no affiliation whatsoever with my professional standing. I informed the director that they were entirely responsible for the fraudulent bids they had recklessly placed, and I fully supported whatever legal action the charity deemed appropriate to take against them. Diana let out a choked, devastated gasp, as the crushing reality of my identity and my total public rejection finally shattered her fragile mind. I did not offer her a second glance. I turned my back on my truly toxic family, stepping out the heavy brass doors of the hotel into the cool night air. I walked directly over to my waiting private chauffeur, leaving them trapped inside to be physically escorted out by the hotel security. I was not physically present at my parents' sprawling suburban mansion the following morning, but Kiara later described the chaotic scene to me with absolute cinematic precision. The sun had barely risen over their perfectly manicured lawn, casting long shadows across the pristine driveway. Their massive home was a physical monument to their boundless arrogance, built entirely on a foundation of hidden debt and toxic vanity. At exactly 7 o'clock, a sharp, forceful knock echoed through the heavy oak front doors. Thomas was already awake, nursing a severe tension headache from the catastrophic public humiliation they had suffered at the charity gala the night before. He expected a delivery driver or perhaps a confused neighbor. Instead, he opened the door to find a licensed process server standing on the grand front porch. The server did not offer a polite morning greeting or a sympathetic smile. He simply asked to confirm my father's identity before shoving a thick, heavy stack of legally binding documents directly into his chest. Thomas stumbled backward, clutching the paperwork as the server turned and walked away without uttering another word. Thomas slammed the heavy front door and marched into the kitchen, throwing the documents onto the central marble island. He grabbed his reading glasses, expecting to find a desperate lawsuit from the charity director or a final warning from his overextended credit card companies. What he read instead made the blood completely drain from his face, leaving him pale and trembling. The bold black letters across the top page dictated a dual notice of foreclosure and immediate asset seizure. The legal mandates were officially stamped and authorized by the executive board of Apex Holdings. The seizure documents did not just target the sprawling suburban mansion they were currently standing inside. They also explicitly targeted the prime commercial building where Isabella operated her fraudulent public relations firm. My parents were completely cornered. The documents clearly outlined that their entire consolidated debt portfolio was now entirely owned and aggressively managed by the exact same corporate entity I had publicly claimed as my own just 12 hours prior. A guttural shout of pure, unadulterated rage erupted from my father's chest, echoing up the grand sweeping staircase. Diana and Isabella rushed down to the kitchen wearing their expensive silk robes, their faces pale with residual panic from the previous night. Thomas shoved the foreclosure notices into their hands, screaming about the complete sudden loss of their massive real estate assets. Isabella began to hyperventilate, clutching the marble countertop for physical support. She realized that her fake business headquarters was being legally ripped away from her. The realization that their entire financial foundation had been systematically dismantled by the daughter they always treated like absolute garbage sent them into a spiral of extreme delusion. Thomas refused to accept that he had been legally outmaneuvered. He aggressively pulled out his phone and summoned an emergency family meeting, demanding that my brother Nathan and his wife Kiara drive to the mansion immediately to help them combat this supposed catastrophic injustice. Nathan and Kiara arrived at the suburban estate less than an hour later. Kiara stepped into the kitchen, radiating calm authority while wearing a sharply tailored beige suit. She immediately sensed the frantic, unhinged energy vibrating through the room. Diana was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor, crying hysterically about losing her high society status and becoming a laughingstock. Isabella was sobbing heavily into a dish towel, complaining that Cameron was currently unreachable and her perfect aesthetic life was completely ruined. Thomas stood at the head of the kitchen island, acting like a deranged military general, preparing for a war he had already spectacularly lost. He began a massive, aggressive rant, explicitly accusing me of engaging in highly illegal corporate espionage. He loudly declared to the room that I must have hacked into his private bank accounts and used my toxic jealousy to manipulate the Apex Holdings executive board into targeting their specific properties out of pure bitter spite. Thomas refused to acknowledge his own reckless financial decisions. He entirely blamed my supposed lifelong resentment for their current impending homelessness. He slammed his hand against the marble island and unveiled his pathetic counterattack. He pulled out a flimsy, poorly formatted legal waiver document that he had forced a cheap, desperate lawyer to draft in the middle of the night. He presented the waiver to Nathan and Kiara with absolute, arrogant certainty. He explained his aggressive master plan to the room. He was going to summon me to the mansion under the guise of a tearful family reconciliation. Once I stepped through the front doors, he planned to physically corner me and ruthlessly bully me into signing away all of Apex Holdings' rights to their properties. He truly believed he could intimidate a senior corporate vice president with loud shouting and cheap parental guilt trips. Thomas puffed out his chest and doubled down on his absolute delusion. He proudly declared that if I refused to sign the waiver and release their seized assets, he would officially disown me from the family legacy forever. He threatened to file a massive, devastating harassment lawsuit against me and my firm, claiming he would drag my professional reputation through the mud until I was fired and totally destitute. He looked at Nathan, demanding that his sons support this unhinged strategy and force me into submission. Nathan looked at his father with absolute, pure disgust. He finally saw the raw, unfiltered toxicity that had governed our family dynamic for decades. He saw a man who would gladly destroy his own hard-working daughter to protect his fraudulent wealth and his spoiled golden child. Before Nathan could even open his mouth to defend me, Kiara stepped seamlessly into the center of the kitchen. Kiara moved with the unmatched poise and lethal grace of a seasoned corporate defense attorney who already knew she had won the case. She completely commanded the atmosphere of the room, cutting instantly through Thomas and his frantic bluster. She did not raise her voice. She did not match their hysterical screaming. She simply placed her expensive leather briefcase onto the kitchen island right next to his pathetic drafted waiver. She clicked the metal clasps open and reached inside. My parents and Isabella fell completely silent, watching her with cautious confusion. Kiara smoothly pulled out a pristine, heavily certified legal document, enclosed in a clear, protective folder. She did not hand it to Thomas immediately. She held it up, letting the bright morning sunlight catch the official certification seals stamped across the bottom of the page. Kiara locked eyes with my father and spoke with chilling professional precision. She calmly explained that she had utilized her own elite legal resources to conduct a deep forensic investigation into their hidden financial history. She placed the certified document directly over his cheap waiver. She revealed that the paperwork was a finalized certified forensic handwriting analysis of the foundational commercial loan agreement from 3 years ago. It was the exact same loan agreement they used to purchase Isabella's fake business headquarters. Kiara watched the last remaining drop of color drain from my mother's face. She informed her horrified in-laws that the forensic expert had conclusively proven that the secondary guarantor signature on that specific financial document was a blatant, malicious forgery. She let the heavy silence stretch across the kitchen, ensuring they felt the crushing weight of their incoming doom. Kiara did not soften her delivery. She looked directly at Thomas and Diana and stated that their reckless decision to forge my signature to secure a better interest rate was not just a simple family misunderstanding. She informed them that their actions constituted a Class 2 felony under federal financial regulations. She explicitly outlined the severe legal consequences of their choices, detailing the mandatory minimum prison sentences associated with aggravated wire fraud and malicious identity theft. Isabella let out a sharp, terrified gasp, stepping backward away from her parents, as if their sudden criminality was physically contagious. Diana grabbed the edge of the kitchen sink, her knees visibly buckling under the intense pressure of imminent federal prosecution. The arrogant, wealthy facade they had maintained for their entire lives was officially dead and buried under a mountain of undeniable evidence. Thomas pivoted instantly from overwhelming panic to blind, irrational rage. His pride refused to accept that he had been bested by the daughter he discarded, and the daughter-in-law he consistently underestimated. He stepped aggressively toward Kiara, pointing his shaking finger directly at her face. He reverted to his usual toxic intimidation tactics, screaming that he would absolutely destroy her legal career for crossing him. He threatened to call the State Bar Association and have her disbarred for threatening her own family members with fraudulent accusations. He roared that he possessed powerful connections in the city who would ensure she never practiced law in Chicago again. Kiara remained entirely unbothered by his frantic, pathetic threats. She did not take a single step backward. She stood her ground and smiled a cold, brilliant, and utterly devastating smile. She slowly checked her designer watch, brushing imaginary dust off her beige suit jacket. She looked Thomas dead in the eyes and delivered her final parting strike. "See you in the boardroom." The primary boardroom at Apex Holdings was specifically designed to strip away the confidence of anyone who walked through its heavy, frosted glass doors. It was a cavernous space dominated by a massive table carved from a single seamless slab of dark, polished slate. The lighting was sharp and clinical, casting no shadows and leaving zero room for deception or evasion. The ambient temperature was always kept 3 degrees colder than the rest of the executive floor, acting as a deliberate psychological tactic to keep opposing parties physically uncomfortable and mentally unbalanced. I sat squarely at the head of the table wearing a pristine charcoal suit, leaning back into my high-backed leather chair. I watched my parents and my sister shrink into the harsh metallic surroundings. They looked completely alien in this environment. The air in the room felt thick with impending corporate execution and absolute ruin. Thomas and Diana sat rigidly near the center of the long slate table. Their typical suburban arrogance had entirely evaporated overnight. The stark reality of the foreclosure notices they received yesterday morning had finally shattered their grand illusions. They looked completely exhausted, terrified, and noticeably older. Next to them sat a man they had frantically hired to legally represent them. He was an incredibly cheap local attorney, wearing a poorly fitted brown suit while nervously gripping a battered leather briefcase. He kept wiping sweat from his damp forehead, clearly out of his depth in a corporate environment that routinely handled billion-dollar acquisitions before lunch. Isabella sat furthest away from me. She was trembling visibly while tightly clutching a flashy designer handbag that was currently financed by a credit card she could no longer use. She kept checking her dark phone screen, desperately waiting for a message. The cheap attorney nervously cleared his throat, attempting to project a false sense of professional authority. He opened a thin manila folder and began to stammer through a remarkably weak opening statement. He claimed that our corporate foreclosure actions were overly aggressive and politely suggested we could reach a simple family settlement to avoid unnecessary litigation. He boldly stated that his clients were upstanding citizens who had merely made a minor administrative oversight regarding their commercial properties. I did not interrupt his pathetic speech. I let him dig his own professional grave with his profound ignorance regarding the massive crimes his clients committed. I just stared at him with a flat, expressionless gaze until his trembling voice faltered and he trailed off into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. He looked down at his notes, realizing he possessed absolutely zero leverage against the towering financial monolith of Apex Holdings. Right at that exact agonizing moment, the heavy boardroom doors swung wide open. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer heels echoed sharply across the polished slate floor. Kiara walked into the room radiating absolute lethal authority. She was wearing a flawless navy blue suit carrying a thick stack of certified legal binders pressed against her side. The color completely drained from my parents' faces when they saw my brother's brilliant wife stepping deeply into my corporate sanctuary. Thomas opened his mouth to loudly object, assuming she was there to emotionally support him as a loyal family member. Before he could utter a single demanding word, Kiara bypassed him entirely. She walked straight to the head of the long table and took the powerful executive chair located directly to my right side. She did not offer them a smile or a greeting of any kind whatsoever today. Kiara placed her heavy binders on the slate table and looked at the cheap attorney with a fierce gaze that could cut through solid steel. She formally introduced herself not as a submissive daughter-in-law, but strictly as the senior corporate counsel for Apex Holdings. She explicitly stated that she was the primary legal architect overseeing the total hostile consolidation of the Thomas and Diana debt portfolio. She watched the cheap attorney swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as he rapidly realized he was facing one of the most formidable and ruthless corporate defense lawyers in Chicago. Kiara did not waste a single second on meaningless pleasantries or fake family traditions. She flipped open her first binder and began systematically dismantling every pathetic legal argument the opposing counsel had prepared to defend my parents. She was an absolute force of nature, unleashing raw, calculated power. She slid a certified forensic handwriting analysis directly across the smooth slate table. She pointed a manicured finger at the foundational commercial loan agreement my parents used to purchase Isabella's business headquarters. Kiara forcefully explained that the secondary guarantor's signature on the document was a proven malicious forgery. She cited specific severe federal statutes confirming that Thomas and Diana had committed aggravated wire fraud and identity theft just to secure a significantly lower interest rate for their favorite child. The chief attorney stared blankly at the forensic certification. His hands began to shake violently as he realized his clients had blatantly lied to him about the true criminal nature of their overwhelming debt. Kiara did not give him a chance to mentally recover or interject. She smoothly slid a second massive stack of thick legal documents toward his side of the table, crushing his spirit. These were the certified unsealed financial records legally subpoenaed from the Internal Revenue Service. Kiara meticulously detailed the massive unpaid tax liabilities deliberately hidden deep within Isabella's fake public relations firm. She ruthlessly exposed the fraudulent transfer of liability forms my father had aggressively tried to force me to sign down in the lobby yesterday. She stated clearly that attempting to actively shift severe corporate tax evasion penalties onto a third party constituted a secondary massive federal conspiracy charge. Diana let out a choked, desperate sob, quickly hiding her tear-stained face in her shaking hands. Thomas stared blankly at the dark slate table, his entire worldview crumbling under the crushing weight of Kiara's irrefutable evidence. They were not just facing total suburban bankruptcy anymore. They were actively facing decades in a federal prison. The chief attorney slowly closed his thin manila folder, completely surrendering his case. He pushed his heavy chair back slightly, physically distancing himself from my incredibly toxic parents. He knew deeply this was no longer a negotiation, but an absolute corporate execution. Isabella suddenly slammed her manicured hands violently on the table, breaking the tense silence of the room. She shrieked loudly that this was all a massive, terrible mistake and demanded that Thomas do something immediately to legally protect her. She aggressively claimed that her booming business was highly successful and that she was merely a helpless victim of my jealous corporate sabotage. She loudly insisted that her perfect husband Cameron would hire a real luxury legal team to destroy Apex Holdings and save her pristine reputation. She frantically pulled out her expensive phone and dialed his number again, screaming hysterically that he was going to fix this massive disaster right now. I leaned forward, resting my elbows upon the cold slate. I looked directly into my sister's deeply panicked eyes. I reached into my leather portfolio and slowly pulled out a single unmarked black folder. I slid it firmly across the long table until it stopped perfectly in front of Isabella's trembling hands. I told her in a low, chilling voice that Cameron was not going to answer her desperate calls today or any other day moving forward. I coldly instructed her to open the black folder and look very closely at the compiled contents inside. Isabella hesitated, her hands shaking violently as she flipped open the thick, dark cover. Inside were high-resolution security photographs and certified banking logs Kiara had legally subpoenaed during her intensive financial investigation. The first glossy photograph clearly showed Cameron standing at an international departure gate at O'Hare Airport, holding two expensive first-class boarding passes while smiling widely. The second photograph showed him tightly wrapping his arm around a young brunette woman who was definitely not my sister. I watched Isabella's eyes dart frantically across the pages as she struggled to process the damning images. I clearly and methodically explained the harsh reality of her situation to the entire silent room. I revealed that Cameron had fully realized my parents' retirement funds were completely drained and empty. Knowing the severe federal tax audits were imminent, he had secretly filed for a secure burner passport. I pointed directly to the highlighted banking logs in the open folder, stating that he had spent the last 3 weeks quietly and systematically liquidating the absolute last remaining tangible assets hidden deep within her fake business structure. I informed Isabella that exactly 1 hour ago, Cameron had successfully boarded a direct luxury flight to Dubai, a jurisdiction offering no extradition treaty. He had taken every single cent of her remaining operational capital and fled the country permanently with his long-term hidden mistress. He had completely abandoned her, leaving her holding the massive, disastrous bag for catastrophic amounts of corporate fraud, unpaid federal taxes, and heavily defaulted predatory loans. Her lavish Instagram lifestyle, her flashy luxury cars, and her elite high society facade were all fully funded by a criminal house of cards that had just violently collapsed directly on top of her. Isabella let out a raw, agonizing scream that tore violently through the quiet corporate boardroom. Her weak knees buckled instantly, and she collapsed directly onto the hard slate floor in a state of absolute blinding hysterics. She sobbed uncontrollably, clawing fiercely at the expensive fabric of her designer dress as the sheer magnitude of her ultimate betrayal and total financial ruin crushed her entire spirit. Thomas and Diana stared down at their beloved golden child, writhing on the ground in total public disgrace. The horrifying realization hit them like a speeding freight train. Their favorite daughter's elite corporate empire was a complete illusion. They had blindly sacrificed their hard-earned retirement, their beautiful suburban home, and their fundamental morality to fund a massive, endless lie. And now they were entirely destitute. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse for any of them. I remained seated calmly at the head of the heavy table, projecting absolute, unyielding authority. I looked down at my parents, watching their arrogant suburban superiority completely disintegrate into pure, paralyzing terror. I leaned forward, intertwining my fingers, and delivered my final devastating ultimatum. I explicitly informed them that the forensic evidence of their felony forgery and wire fraud was fully compiled and ready to be transmitted. I stated that the massive legal file was prepped to be sent directly to the federal prosecutor's office. They had exactly 2 options left. They could leave this boardroom right now and face immediate aggressive federal prosecution, resulting in mandatory minimum prison sentences for their extensive financial crimes. Or they could pick up the metal pens resting on the table and legally sign over the deeds to every single asset they currently owned. I demanded the immediate, unconditional, absolute surrender of the suburban mansion and the commercial building directly to Apex Holdings to fully satisfy their consolidated debt portfolio. I raised my left wrist, slowly checking the dial on my expensive watch. I looked Thomas dead in his terrified eyes and coldly told him he had exactly 60 seconds to make his final choice before I officially finalized the total ruin of his pathetic life and sent him away forever. The large analog clock mounted on the far wall of the Apex Holdings boardroom clicked with a heavy mechanical rhythm. Each movement of the second hand echoed through the freezing room like a hammer striking an anvil. I sat perfectly still at the head of the dark slate table, watching the complete psychological destruction of my abusers unfold in real time. My parents had spent my entire life dictating the rules of engagement, always ensuring the game was rigged entirely in their favor. They had utilized emotional blackmail, financial leverage, and relentless public humiliation to keep me confined to the role of their designated punching bag. But the rules had changed permanently. I was the one keeping score now, and the final tally was absolutely devastating. The cheap local attorney my parents had hired was currently sweating profusely as he reviewed the final settlement documents Kiara had placed in front of him. He ran a shaking finger down the columns of certified forensic evidence, comparing the forged signatures against the federal statutes Chiara had meticulously cited. I watched the remaining blood drain completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He was a man who typically handled minor suburban disputes and petty civil claims. He was entirely unequipped to navigate a multi-million-dollar corporate execution involving aggravated wire fraud and felony identity theft. He slowly closed the heavy legal binder and pushed it slightly away from himself, as if the paper itself was radioactive. He leaned in closely toward Thomas and Diana, keeping his voice to a frantic, terrified whisper. He did not sugarcoat their reality. He bluntly informed them that Chiara had constructed an inescapable legal trap. He told my parents that they possessed absolutely zero leverage and no defensive strategy whatsoever. He explicitly warned them that if they did not sign the asset surrender documents right, this exact second the federal prosecutors would secure mandatory minimum prison sentences for both of them. He told Thomas that he would absolutely die in a federal penitentiary if they attempted to fight this in court. The reality of impending incarceration finally shattered my mother's impenetrable wall of suburban arrogance. Diana realized that her aggressive demands and elite social posturing held absolutely no power in this frozen corporate environment. She resorted to the only weapon she had left in her toxic arsenal. She attempted to deploy the ultimate emotional manipulation. Diana pushed her chair back and stood up, her knees trembling visibly. She let out a loud, agonizing sob, forcing tears to stream rapidly down her meticulously made-up face. She clasped her hands together and looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. She began to weep loudly, putting on a desperate theatrical performance meant to trigger a lifetime of conditioned guilt. She cried out my name, begging me to remember that she was my mother. She frantically recounted stories of my infancy, claiming she had held me in her arms when I was a sick baby and sacrificed her youth to provide me with a roof over my head. She wept about the sacred bond between a mother and her daughter, pleading with me to show mercy and forgive their minor financial mistakes. She begged me not to render her homeless in her old age, claiming her heart could not withstand the cruelty of her own child, stripping away her beautiful sanctuary. I sat back in my leather executive chair and watched her perform. I did not blink. I did not offer a single ounce of comfort or sympathy. I felt absolutely nothing for the weeping woman standing across from me. The emotional strings she had spent 3 decades installing inside my mind had been completely severed. I waited until her frantic sobbing echoed into a pathetic, whimpering silence. I kept my voice incredibly low, forcing everyone in the room to lean forward to hear my response. I looked directly into Diana's terrified eyes and delivered my verdict with lethal precision. I told her that I remembered exactly how she treated me. I recalled the decades of targeted exclusion, the relentless mocking of my supposed poverty, and the sheer delight she took in humiliating me in front of the Chicago elite. I mirrored the exact phrase she had used against me at the restaurant during Isabella's disastrous engagement dinner. I told my mother that she was absolutely right about one specific thing. Real family does indeed come first. I explained that this was exactly why I was legally and surgically removing toxic parasites from my life. I was actively protecting my real family, which consisted of myself, Nathan, Chiara, and the people who actually respected my existence. Diana let out a choked, devastated gasp and collapsed back into her heavy chair. Her final desperate manipulation had failed spectacularly, bouncing off my armor without leaving a single scratch. Thomas stared at the dark slate table, his shoulders slumped forward in total defeat. He looked like a hollow, empty shell of the domineering patriarch he had pretended to be just 24 hours ago. He realized that his cheap lawyer was right. He had to choose between his massive suburban mansion and a federal prison cell. He reached forward with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy metal pen resting next to the surrender documents. His hand shook so violently he could barely grip the silver barrel. He placed the pen against the signature line and signed away the deed to his sprawling estate. He legally surrendered everything he had built his entire identity around. He passed the documents to Diana, who sobbed uncontrollably as she added her signature, formally relinquishing her rights to the property and confirming her immediate destitution. They officially handed over the keys to their fake empire today. Isabella was sitting completely paralyzed at the far end of the long table. She was still processing the horrific reality that Cameron had emptied her accounts and abandoned her to flee the country with his hidden mistress. She looked absolutely ruined. Her designer clothes suddenly seemed pathetic and hollow, wrapping a woman who possessed absolutely zero actual substance. Kiara slid the commercial lease surrender forms directly in front of my sister. Isabella did not argue or attempt to throw a tantrum. The fight had been completely drained from her body. She picked up a pen and signed the termination documents, officially surrendering the massive office building that had served as the headquarters for her fraudulent public relations firm. She signed away the backdrop of her wealthy Instagram illusion, legally admitting that she owned absolutely nothing. The golden child was now officially broke abandoned and entirely stripped of her fake elite status forever. I watched them complete the final signatures marking the absolute end of their reign of terror. I reached across the cold slate table and collected the heavy stack of signed legal documents. I tapped the edges against the table, aligning the pages with calm, methodical precision. I turned to my right and handed the entire consolidated asset file directly to Kiara. I instructed her to file the deeds with the county clerk and initiate the formal transfer protocols immediately. Kiara nodded, taking the documents with a sharp, triumphant smile, confirming the total victory of our legal strategy. I turned my attention back to the three defeated individuals sitting across from me. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table to deliver my final unyielding ultimatum clearly. I informed Thomas, Diana, and Isabella that the legal transfer of their assets was now officially complete. Apex Holdings was the sole owner of their suburban mansion and the commercial office building. I explicitly stated that they were no longer welcome on my corporate properties. I told them that my elite liquidations team was already en route to the suburban estate, accompanied by armed private security contractors. They had exactly 24 hours to return to the mansion and pack whatever personal belongings they could physically fit into the trunks of their vehicles. I clarified that any furniture, art, or luxury items purchased using the fraudulent credit lines were now considered seized corporate assets and could not be removed from the premises under any circumstances. I looked at the ticking clock on the boardroom wall and told them their time was already running out quickly. I instructed them to leave my building immediately and warned them that if they were not completely off the suburban property, by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, the security team would physically throw them out onto the cold street and change the locks permanently. It was exactly 7:45 in the morning. I sat in the back seat wearing a sharp beige trench coat over a tailored black suit. I held my encrypted phone against my ear, listening to Kiara update me from across the city. Kiara was currently stationed at the loading dock of the commercial building that formerly housed my sister's fraudulent public relations firm. My sister-in-law reported that a separate Apex Holdings liquidation crew had already breached the commercial property. They were busy dragging out expensive velvet sofas, ring lights, and cheap acrylic desks, tossing them directly into commercial dumpsters. Kiara noted with a sharp, victorious laugh that the supposedly booming business headquarters did not contain a single piece of actual client paperwork, just thousands of dollars in unpaid cosmetic invoices and empty champagne bottles. I thanked Kiara for her flawless execution and ended the call, just as my driver pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the suburban estate. The gates were standing wide open. My parents had clearly been awake all night long. A fleet of dark corporate vehicles parked precisely along the edge of the manicured lawn. My elite liquidation team stepped out accompanied by 4 heavily armed private security contractors. I walked up the sweeping concrete driveway, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The scene unfolding before me was the absolute definition of suburban degradation. The grand front doors of the mansion were propped open with a heavy brass planter. Diana and Thomas were frantically sprinting back and forth across the grand foyer. They were desperately shoving loose clothing, mismatched shoes, and whatever small valuables they could physically carry into heavy black plastic garbage bags. The pristine illusion of their wealth had been reduced to literal trash bags being dragged across the expensive hardwood floors. A rusted rented moving van sat idling near the garage, looking entirely out of place in the upscale neighborhood. Isabella emerged from the house carrying a massive stack of designer handbags she had managed to hoard before the financial freeze. Her face was red and blotchy from crying all night. She looked absolutely feral. She spotted my security team advancing up the driveway and completely panicked. She unlocked the luxury vehicle and threw her body into the driver's seat, desperately trying to salvage at least one major status symbol from the wreckage of her fake life. The engine roared to life, echoing loudly across the quiet suburban street. She threw the car into reverse, intending to speed past my team and flee the property. She did not make it past the property line. A massive, heavy-duty tow truck suddenly swung into the driveway, completely blocking the exit path. Isabella slammed her palms against the steering wheel, honking the horn in a blind panic. Isabella slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt just inches from the steel bumper of the tow truck. Two burly repossession agents stepped out of the truck holding digital tablets. Isabella rolled down her window and began screaming hysterically, demanding they move their vehicle immediately. I walked slowly up to the driver's side window, resting my hand firmly on the polished roof of the sports car. I looked down at my frantic sister and delivered the harsh financial reality. I informed her that when Apex Holdings consolidated her massive debt portfolio, I did not just stop at the commercial real estate and the unpaid federal taxes. I had specifically located the predatory subprime auto loan she used to lease this flashy vehicle. I had legally purchased the auto loan debt too. The repossession agent stepped forward, bypassing me entirely. They demanded the keys, notifying Isabella that the vehicle was officially seized due to extreme payment delinquency. Isabella gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. She sobbed violently, begging me to let her keep the car, claiming she needed it to find a job. I simply tapped the roof of the car and told the agents to proceed. The liquidation team moved swiftly into the mansion, stepping over the remaining garbage bags to begin cataloging the seized corporate assets. My private security contractors established a firm perimeter around the front porch, directing my parents toward their rented truck. The reality of their permanent eviction finally set in. They were losing the physical monument to their boundless arrogance. Thomas dropped a plastic bag full of ties and turned to face me. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He marched down the front steps, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He stopped just outside the security perimeter, breathing heavily. He screamed that I was a vindictive monster who had destroyed her own flesh and blood for the sake of corporate greed. He cursed my existence and told me that as of this exact moment, I was officially dead to him. He swore he would never look at my face or speak my name again for as long as he lived. I stood completely motionless, absorbing the violent outburst without flinching. His words held absolutely zero power over me anymore. I did not raise my voice or attempt to match his hysterical anger. I looked him dead in his eyes and delivered my final response with lethal clarity. I told him that his threat meant absolutely nothing to me. I informed him that he had died to me years ago on the exact day he chose to protect a beautiful lie over his own hardworking daughter. I stated that he had sold his soul to fund a fake empire, and now he was getting exactly what he paid for. I signaled to the lead security contractor. The heavily armed guard stepped forward, forming a solid wall of muscle between me and my former family. They explicitly ordered Thomas, Diana, and Isabella to vacate the premises immediately or face arrest for criminal trespassing on private corporate property. My parents and my sister huddled together near the rusted moving van, looking completely pathetic and entirely defeated. Diana let out one final wailing sob as she climbed into the passenger seat of the truck. Thomas slid into the driver's side, gripping the cheap plastic steering wheel with shaking hands. Isabella climbed into the cramped back area, sitting among the garbage bags filled with her ruined designer clothes. The engine of the rental van sputtered and coughed a harsh, contrasting sound against the quiet wealth of the neighborhood. Thomas slowly drove the van down the long concrete driveway, passing the seized white Porsche and the imposing tow truck. I stood on the pristine front lawn and watched them cross the property threshold for the absolute last time in their lives. As the rear bumper of the moving van cleared the entrance, the security contractors initiated the perimeter lockdown protocols. The massive, heavy wrought iron gates began to swing shut, their hinges groaning slightly in the crisp morning air. The thick metal doors collided in the center of the driveway, locking together with a loud, definitive metallic clang. The sound echoed across the empty suburban street, sealing them out of their old life forever. The fortress they had built to exclude me had officially become my property, and they were permanently exiled. I watched the moving van turn the corner and disappear from sight, fading into the obscurity they so deeply deserved. The air felt incredibly light and fresh. The toxic rot that had infected my life for 3 decades was finally physically removed. The crisp morning air outside the suburban mansion carried the distinct scent of absolute victory, but the corporate execution was not entirely finished. Isabella was currently sobbing in the back of a rented moving van, firmly believing her husband had already successfully escaped the country with the last remnants of her fraudulent empire. She was completely oblivious to the silent, invisible snare I had meticulously laid out across the international financial network. I turned away from the heavy wrought iron gates and stepped into the back of my waiting town car. I instructed my driver to take me directly to O'Hare International Airport. Chiara was already waiting for me inside the terminal, having secured our access to the exclusive first-class departure lounge overlooking the international concourses. We sat in plush leather chairs, sipping dark roasted coffee, and watching the chaotic flow of travelers moving through the vast, brightly lit terminal below us. The atmosphere was a sharp contrast to the frantic desperation of the suburban eviction. Here, everything operated with mechanical precision. We were perfectly positioned to watch a highly calculated trap snap shut on a man who thought he could steal from my bloodline and simply vanish into the wind. The reality of Cameron and his grand escape plan was far more pathetic than the illusion he had constructed. 12 hours prior to this exact moment, Chiara had utilized her elite corporate defense network to completely dissect his digital footprint. She uncovered the frantic, desperate moves of a man who realized the financial well was running permanently dry. Cameron had not boarded that direct luxury flight to Dubai. That highly publicized, expensive ticket was nothing but a calculated decoy designed specifically to throw Isabella off his scent and buy himself a few extra hours of freedom. His actual destination was a non-extradition country buried deep in a completely different hemisphere. He had booked 2 seats on a quiet, untrackable charter flight scheduled to depart late this morning. However, Cameron faced one massive logistical hurdle. He could not simply wire the stolen retirement funds from his laptop. To move that specific amount of illicitly gained capital across international borders, he required physical authentication at a highly specialized offshore banking terminal. That specific high-security terminal was located exclusively inside the international departure zone at O'Hare. From our elevated vantage point inside the departure lounge, Chiara and I watched the specific banking kiosk with hawkish intensity. Right on schedule, Cameron appeared in the crowded concourse below. He was not alone. Walking closely beside him was the young brunette woman who had been his hidden mistress for years. They moved with a hurried, arrogant stride, dragging matching designer suitcases behind them. Cameron kept checking his expensive watch, sweating visibly under the bright fluorescent lights of the terminal. He believed he had successfully outsmarted my entire family. He genuinely thought he was mere minutes away from finalizing his grand theft and stepping onto a private jet to start a wealthy new life on a pristine foreign beach. He approached the sleek metallic counter of the offshore banking terminal, acting with a forced casual confidence. He placed his hands on the cool glass and engaged the banking teller, requesting the immediate release and international transfer of the consolidated funds he had drained from my parents' completely ruined retirement accounts. The teller maintained a perfectly neutral expression, requesting his documentation to authorize the massive wire transfer. Cameron proudly handed over his newly acquired secondary passport, completely unaware that his financial death warrant had already been signed. I had not spent the night merely dismantling my parents' suburban estate. I had used my vast executive authority at Apex Holdings to ruthlessly manipulate the global banking infrastructure. Anticipating his exact strategy, I had integrated our corporate legal framework with federal financial monitoring systems. I flagged every single cent of those stolen retirement funds under the strictest federal anti-money laundering statutes available. I had classified the capital as highly illicit, seized assets tied directly to ongoing corporate fraud investigations. The trap was completely invisible, but forged from unbreakable federal law. As the teller took the passport and inserted it into the secure terminal scanner, Cameron offered his mistress a smug, reassuring smile. He fully expected the machine to print a confirmation receipt granting him total financial freedom. Instead of a confirmation prompt, the computer terminal screen instantly flashed a brilliant, aggressive red. The color reflected off the polished counter, bathing Cameron and his panicked face in a harsh crimson glow. The teller looked at the screen, their professional demeanor tightening into immediate high alert protocol. A silent, heavily encrypted alarm triggered instantaneously across the federal law enforcement network, silently pinging every single agent currently stationed within the airport perimeter. The teller politely asked Cameron to wait for just a moment, claiming the system required a brief routine security override for a transaction of this specific magnitude. Cameron immediately lost his smug confidence. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and deeply terrified. He glanced around the crowded terminal, his paranoia spiking as he realized his incredibly narrow window of escape was violently slamming shut right in front of his eyes. The mistress shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. The response was terrifyingly swift and executed with absolute flawless precision. From the bustling crowds of ordinary travelers, several individuals suddenly broke their casual stride. Men and women who had been quietly reading newspapers, sipping coffee, or browsing duty-free kiosks abandoned their covers entirely. They converged on the offshore banking counter from 4 different directions, moving with the unmistakable coordinated authority of plainclothes federal agents. Cameron noticed them closing in entirely too late. He took one frantic step backward, abandoning his passport on the glass counter. But there was absolutely nowhere left to run. The agents surrounded him instantly, forming a tight, inescapable physical perimeter. They efficiently forced his arms securely behind his back, ignoring his loud, panicked protests and his desperate attempts to pull away. The mistress shrieked in pure terror, stumbling backward into the crowd as the federal agents firmly applied heavy steel handcuffs to Cameron and locked his wrists together. At that exact agonizing moment, a completely unhinged figure burst through the crowds near the security checkpoints. It was Isabella. She had somehow managed to access the location tracking data on Cameron and his hidden secondary phone, driving frantically to the airport in a blind, desperate attempt to confront him. She looked absolutely feral. Her designer clothing was rumpled, her makeup was heavily smeared down her cheeks, and her hair was a chaotic mess. She sprinted across the polished terminal floors, her heels clicking wildly as she shoved past confused travelers. She arrived at the banking kiosk just in time to witness the total catastrophic destruction of her entire universe. She skidded to a halt, completely paralyzed by the scene unfolding directly in front of her. She watched in sheer, unadulterated horror as the federal agents firmly read her husband his rights, loudly declaring his extensive list of severe financial crimes and money laundering violations. Isabella stood frozen, unable to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. She was watching the man she thought would rescue her being treated like a common criminal in the middle of an international airport. But the devastation did not stop there. Her wide, terrified eyes slowly drifted from her handcuffed husband to the terrified brunette woman, shrinking against the wall just a few feet away. The realization hit Isabella with the force of a speeding freight train. She saw the matching luggage. She saw the intimate proximity. She finally understood that Cameron was not just fleeing the crushing tax debts and the corporate fallout. He was actively running away with another woman. He had fully intended to leave Isabella utterly destitute, humiliated, and facing federal tax evasion charges completely alone, while he funded a lavish tropical lifestyle for his secret lover, using her own parents' stolen retirement money. Cameron was aggressively marched away by the federal agents, his face buried in his chest, to hide his absolute public disgrace. He was dragged through the concourse screaming pathetic excuses that echoed uselessly off the high ceilings. Isabella was left standing alone in the center of the bustling airport, completely hyperventilating. Her entire fake elite empire had been systematically reduced to absolutely nothing. She had no home, no business, no husband, and zero access to capital. She clutched her chest, gasping for air as the travelers around her stared with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Then her frantic, wandering gaze slowly drifted upward toward the second level of the terminal. She scanned the glass walls of the exclusive first-class departure lounge and immediately froze. Through the thick, soundproof glass, Isabella locked eyes directly with me. I was standing perfectly still near the edge of the lounge, flanked by Kiara. My brilliant sister-in-law stood tall and proud, radiating the quiet, lethal power of a corporate attorney who had flawlessly engineered this entire forensic takedown. I did not smile. I did not wave. I simply looked down at my broken sister with a cold, empty expression, projecting absolute, untouchable authority. I watched the gears slowly turn inside her panicked mind. I watched the exact second the horrific realization finally dawned on her. Isabella connected the sudden frozen bank accounts, the brutal corporate foreclosures, the ruthless boardroom execution, and now this perfectly timed federal interception. She finally understood that none of this was a coincidence or bad luck. She realized that I had orchestrated the entire spectacular collapse of her life from the very beginning. The crushing weight of her defeat should have completely broken her spirit. It should have forced her to reflect on her own profound cruelty and the decades of abuse she had eagerly participated in. Instead, Isabella proved exactly why she was the golden child of a deeply toxic family. The sheer terror and despair on her face rapidly melted away violently, replaced by a mask of pure, unhinged, vindictive rage. She refused to accept accountability for her own fraudulent actions. She refused to accept that her husband was a parasite. In her deeply delusional mind, I was the sole malicious villain who had illegally destroyed her perfect, pristine existence out of pure, bitter jealousy. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid, as a new desperate strategy formed in her chaotic brain. Having lost her wealth, her husband, and her dignity, Isabella realized she had absolutely nothing left to lose. She reached into her expensive designer handbag with shaking, frantic hands and pulled out her smartphone. She glared up at me through the thick glass, her eyes burning with a venomous, hateful fire. She was not going to surrender quietly. She aggressively tapped the screen, navigating directly to her extensive contact list. She began frantically dialing the private numbers of notorious local gossip bloggers, sensationalist journalists, and aggressive daytime news stations. She was preparing to launch a massive fabricated public smear campaign to paint herself as the ultimate helpless victim of a ruthless corporate billionaire's sister. The war was shifting from the boardroom directly to the vicious court of public opinion. Isabella did not waste a single second after the disastrous airport interception. She immediately activated her remaining network of superficial social media contacts to orchestrate a massive public retaliation. By the following morning, she had aggressively secured a prime guest spot on a wildly popular Chicago daytime talk show known for its sensationalist drama and eager audience. The studio was brightly lit, featuring plush velvet seating designed specifically to make guests feel comfortable while they spilled their most intimate secrets to the viewing public. Isabella arrived on set wearing a plain, unbranded gray sweater, deliberately stripping away her usual flashy designer labels to appear humble, relatable, and utterly broken. She sat across from the charismatic host and began to weave a breathtakingly fabricated narrative. She stared directly into the broadcasting cameras and squeezed out genuine tears, claiming she was the innocent victim of a ruthless, jealous older sister. She spun a tragic, emotional sob story, telling the captivated audience that I was a bitter corporate billionaire who had illegally stolen our parents' beloved suburban home out of lifelong toxic spite. She claimed I had maliciously orchestrated the sudden destruction of her perfect marriage simply because I could not bear to see her happy. She portrayed herself as a hardworking public relations professional whose entire life had been violently dismantled by my unchecked corporate greed. The studio audience gasped in collective horror at her perfectly delivered performance, completely captivated by the tragic illusion she projected under the bright television lights. The internet consumed her fabricated tragedy with absolute veracity. Within hours, clipped segments of her tearful television interview were circulating rapidly across every major social media platform. Digital mobs mobilized instantly, branding me as the evil corporate sister who preyed on her own vulnerable family. They created viral hashtags demanding my immediate termination from the business sector. Comment sections overflowed with visceral hatred from strangers who believed every single agonizing tear Isabella manufactured. My professional inbox and personal email were flooded with aggressive inquiries from local news stations, investigative journalists, and eager bloggers demanding an immediate statement. They wanted a chaotic public brawl. They wanted me to defend myself, to release an emotional plea, and to engage in a messy, undignified public shouting match to boost their daily ratings. I sat at my sleek desk on the executive floor of Apex Holdings, watching the chaotic digital sphere erupt on my dual monitors. I remained completely serene. I issued a strict, unyielding policy of total silence. I instructed my corporate communications team to firmly decline every single request for an interview with a flat professional refusal to comment. I absolutely refused to step down into the mud and participate in her desperate attention-seeking circus. I knew from years of hostile corporate acquisitions that engaging with a frantic liar only validates their manufactured illusion. I was entirely content to let Isabella build her fragile house of cards as high as she possibly could, knowing exactly how devastating the impending fall would be when gravity finally took over. The timing of our response was meticulously calculated to inflict maximum psychological and social damage. We patiently waited until Isabella's live interview reached its absolute peak viewership, capturing the attention of the entire city. Right as the daytime host was leaning forward to offer my weeping sister a sympathetic tissue, Kiara executed the ultimate legal kill shot. Acting in her official capacity as senior corporate counsel for Apex Holdings, Kiara bypassed the amateur gossip bloggers entirely. She legally unsealed the certified public court records and simultaneously blasted the comprehensive, unredacted financial dossiers directly to the news desks of every major syndicated media outlet in the state. The entire digital operation was executed with the chilling precision of a military strike. Kiara utilized secure press distribution channels that guaranteed the documents bypassed editorial delays and went straight to the live broadcasting desks. Kiara did not include any emotional commentary or defensive public relations statements. She simply provided the raw, irrefutable, terrifying data. The heavily certified distributed documents contained the forensic evidence of Thomas and Diana committing felony forgery on the foundational commercial loan applications. The files meticulously detailed Isabella's massive six-figure federal tax fraud, exposing the complete lack of any actual paying clients in her fake public relations firm. Finally, Kiara included the official police reports and federal anti-money laundering alerts detailing Cameron's aggressive embezzlement and his subsequent humiliating arrest at the international terminal. The financial receipts were absolute, comprehensive, and legally undeniable. The truth was now weaponized and rapidly distributing across the global network, reaching every screen in the city. The explosive shift in the public narrative happened in a matter of minutes. Back inside the brightly lit television studio, the host was mid-sentence loudly condemning my supposed corporate cruelty when a frantic producer rushed directly onto the active set. The producer hastily handed the host a glowing digital tablet, urgently pointing at the breaking news alerts, rapidly flooding the screen. I watched the live broadcast from my office as the host's expression transformed from sympathetic outrage to stunned realization. The host, recognizing a massive, unprecedented ratings opportunity, seamlessly pivoted the direction of the interview. She looked up from the glowing tablet and stared directly at Isabella with a hardened, journalistic gaze. The host interrupted my sister's manufactured sobbing and began reading the breaking news headlines aloud on live television. She boldly confronted Isabella with the hard, undeniable evidence of her $150,000 tax evasion. She read the severe federal charges regarding her parents' felony forgery to the silent studio audience. The studio audience gasped in sheer disbelief as the devastating reality of the situation unfolded before their very eyes. The carefully crafted illusion was collapsing on live television without any possibility of commercial interruption. She asked Isabella to explain exactly why her perfect husband was currently sitting in federal custody for attempting to flee the country with stolen retirement funds. Isabella froze entirely. The mask of the innocent victimized sister violently shattered under the harsh studio lights. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, realizing she was trapped on a live broadcast with absolutely no escape route and no more lies left to spin. The silence in the studio was deafening. The sheer panic consumed my sister completely. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp, aggressively ripping the small lapel microphone off her gray sweater. She physically bolted from her chair, knocking her glass of water onto the studio floor. She sprinted off the set, her frantic footsteps echoing through the quiet studio as the cameras captured every single second of her absolute, unmitigated disgrace. The internet reaction flipped instantaneously. The same digital crowds that had blindly supported her just moments ago began ruthlessly tearing her apart. Her tight circle of flashy influencer friends, terrified of being associated with federal tax fraud and public humiliation, immediately began unfollowing her. They rapidly issued public statements, distancing themselves from her toxic brand to save their own lucrative sponsorships. Miles away from the downtown studio, the reality of their permanent social destruction finally landed on the true architects of this disaster. Thomas and Diana were sitting in a cheap, dingy roadside motel room. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cleaning supplies, creating a harsh, unforgiving contrast to the sprawling suburban mansion they had lost just yesterday. They were huddled together on the edge of a sagging, floral-patterned mattress, watching a small, outdated television screen mounted on the peeling wall. They watched in sheer, paralyzed horror as their golden child fled the talk show set in total public ruin. The news anchors had completely stopped discussing my supposed corporate greed and were now displaying high-resolution graphics detailing my parents' specific felony charges. Thomas and Diana stared at the screen as their names, their faces, and their severe financial crimes were broadcast to the entire city. They realized in that cramped, freezing motel room that their elite social standing, their carefully curated neighborhood reputation, and their entire suburban identity were absolutely and permanently obliterated. They could no longer hide behind their fake wealth or their manufactured prestige. The federal authorities were already building the prosecution files, and their faces were permanently etched into the public consciousness as arrogant suburban fraudsters. The local news station displayed a sprawling timeline of their deception, completely dismantling every single lie they had ever told to their peers. Diana clutched a cheap synthetic pillow to her chest, weeping tears of genuine, unadulterated terror as she realized her country club friends were actively watching her spectacular downfall on live television. Thomas stared blankly at the flickering screen, his hands shaking violently as the news anchor detailed the mandatory minimum prison sentences associated with their documented financial crimes. The fortress of arrogance they had built over 3 decades had been entirely reduced to digital ash in a matter of minutes. The complete public destruction was swift, brutal, and entirely of their own making.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.